intuitively you see that you see a 3-0 pitch, and you know, well, more often than not, you're going to get that strike call, and you see an 0-2 pitch, and it's very hard to get that third strike. But we plotted this. I mean, again, this is where sports data points really helps. I think we looked at something like 1.5 million pitches, and you can see from this that the strike zone changes pretty radically. We think the strike zone, it is what it is, and it's a zone, and it's from your chest to your knee, but it turns out that it really varies based on the count, and that gets bigger the later in the game it is, and this discrepancy gets bigger the closer the score as well. So we definitely saw this evidence of this omission bias, sort of the baseball equivalent of whistle swallowing with balls and strikes. We looked at, fast forward here, you know, we also, I mean, just a quick additional point, we saw this with stars as well, that a star, Albert Pujols, comes up, and when it's a 3-0 pitch, he actually has an even bigger strike zone than other players. Because again, the umpires are sort of intuitively, they know people want to see the players put the ball in play. But we looked at this in basketball as well, and what we found in basketball was a little different. I think basketball probably gets they get it the worst out of the 4 major sports in terms of referee bias and conspiracy theories. And granted, it doesn't help that we recently had a referee who in fact was corrupt. But I mean, you know, you always hear every play down they could call a foul, and there's a star treatment, and basketball is tough to quantify in this respect. I mean, people always say, "Oh, Kobe shot 12 free throws in the 4th quarter alone. How unfair!" And yet, you know, when you really think about it, he's the best player on the team. He's got the ball in his hands a disproportionate amount of time, especially in a close game, especially in the 4th quarter, and he's got probably 2, sometimes 3 times as many hands grabbing at him. It's not surprising sometimes that he shoots a disproportionate amount of free throws. But what we found when we looked at basketball in terms of this omission bias was something interesting. We saw that for certain calls, for judgment calls, for ambiguous calls, they went way down in the 4th quarter. Something like traveling. Mark Madsen's not here. I saw him on the roster. I guess he'll come later. But hoping to ask him this. But for example, traveling gets called about half as often as in the 4th quarter as it does in the first half. And I don't think players are adjusting their footwork in the 4th quarter in a way different than they did early in the game. I think it's just that call's not being made. And yet for other calls, remember, omission bias also talks about this sort of this internal risk analysis department. For other calls that have to be made, something like a guy, I don't know if anyone see the game last night. It was a great example of this in this Atlanta-Orlando game, where last play of the game and their bodies going everywhere. I think one player even was bleeding, and you had no foul call, but the player had his foot on the line. That's the call that got made. And we think that was typical. What we see is that when there's an ambiguous call in basketball late in the game, the refs swallow the whistle. When there's a call that isn't ambiguous, it has to be made. A guy's foot's on the line, and there's not much arguing about that. Then you sort of have the swing the other way. Then he feels like he has to inject himself because he's really going to hear about it if you miss that call when the shot clock expires or when it takes more than 10 seconds to bring the ball past half court. That's a call you've got to make. So we thought this play, everyone, just curious, anyone guess what this play is, just to start things off? There you go. You want to tell everyone? So this is the Chris Webber time. So I figure some of you guys probably weren't eating solid food when this happened, but it was college for me. I already played in the Bay Area. So this is the infamous Chris Webber play. And everybody remembers that he called a timeout when his team didn't have any, but few people remember what preceded this, which is, I'm going to play it here in a sec, but it is the most flagrant traveling call you will ever see. And it goes uncalled. And I was thinking, I have a 9-year-old son that plays basketball in one of these leagues where you get away. If the 9-year-old league had traveled this flagrantly, I think they would have made the call. And yet, it's the last few seconds, championship game, this is the most high-pressure situation, close game, last few seconds, and Chris Webber commits this travel, and you'll see he sort of looks at the ref as if to beg him not to call it, and the other coach, Dean Smith, is going crazy, and the traveling call, as far away from the official as I am from this gentleman here, doesn't get called. It's only when he calls the timeout. I'll play this, you can sort of see this in action. So we thought that was omission bias in basketball in a nutshell, where you've got this. It wasn't particularly ambiguous, but in theory it's a judgment call. Did he travel? Did he not? That goes uncalled. But if a guy calls a timeout and his team doesn't have any left, that's a call you've got to make. So and what we saw in basketball, we looked at this in the NBA, and you can see that for these, for the ambiguous calls, for the judgment calls, I mean, look how much traveling goes down. I mean, the red is overtime, which is fewer minutes, obviously, but still, look at the yellow. Palming way down, and again, we don't think that, it's the fourth quarter, we better not palm the ball. We think this is just the ref's discretion, and yet you look at some of the less subjective calls, sort of something like a loose ball or a kick ball, ball goes off a guy's foot, you can't swallow the whistle on that one. Those calls are being made at, in some cases, a greater frequency, but just as high depending on the time of game. And what we saw in other sports, something very similar. And again, this is sort of the beauty of sports right here, where if this held up in one sport and not others, we'd have to look a little deeply. But when something replicates itself sport by sport by sport, I think we looked at this at 5 or 6 different sports, you feel like you're onto something. So you can see in the NFL, we have something very similar where, some of this was before replay and some of this was after. But again, you can see that something like too many men on the field, you've got to make that call. But look how some of these other calls dip in the fourth quarter. And our famous example for this one, does anyone remember the Giants-Patriots Super Bowl a few years ago with the catch on the helmet? Yeah. So again, people remember the catch. What they don't remember was what preceded it, which was what we think is a pretty flagrant in-the-grasp call. You've got this in-the-grasp rule where if you it's designed to protect the quarterbacks, and if you're on the verge of sacking them and you grab the guy, they call it a sack even before you're formally tackled him. And if you watch this play and watch this develop, you'll see what we think is a pretty flagrant in the grasp call go completely unremarked upon. But again, it's the Super Bowl, huge game, close game, last minute. You don't want to be that referee. You don't want to insinuate yourself in the situation. You'd rather, again, give into this omission bias and sort of let the call stand. And so I'm going to play this and see if you can detect the omission bias here. So
if the ref would have made that call, he would have lost his job.
exactly. Did everybody hear that?
Yeah. If the ref would have called that a sack, he would have lost his job.
Or worse, or he would needed a police escort. Right. On the other hand, you watch that play, and if you watch football, something tells me if that were the first quarter of a Raiders game in October, and you're grabbing jersey like that, you don't think so?
No, I don't think that'd be called in first quarter either. He wasn't in the arm. He was escaping.
The other thing too, we've had this debate. I have to say, to his everlasting credit, the official talked to us and said, "Look, I know it's controversial, but another split second and I would have made that call, but I stand by it. I think I made the right call." But there also was potential holding on that play. I mean, people have watched that and said you could have called you could have made 3 different calls there. But again, you cannot make that call. If you sort of watch sports and have a sense of the rhythms, you can't make that call the last minute of the Super Bowl. Other officials said, it's a judgment call, but you see the official was right there. He wouldn't blow the whistle. So Patriot fans will say that whistle swallowing cost them that Super Bowl. And again, we looked at this in hockey, same kind of, same sort of results where the flagrant calls, the calls that have to get made, those in some cases go up, but the other calls that are judgment calls, those go down in the other periods. So, overall, we thought there was a pretty good evidence that this whistle swallowing that we intuitively think happens, that empirically that we backed that up and thought that it did. And I'll wrap up quickly here.